I'll start recording. Right. Welcome back, everyone. So the students has got video is turned off. Right. Our first open lecture will be the Unit 1 tutor by James. Maybe and Joan and Ja as well, or maybe James yourself.
It's just me this time, yeah.
Okay, yeah. And then I know we had a chance to listen the Unit 1, 2, 3, 4 tutors presentation this morning, but we thought as a business school participants, it would be great to see more in detail each other's unit so that we can understand, and then maybe it will be helpful for all of us to listen and then criticize other work within our joint critics and the final critics. So please welcome James. I'll put my microphone over to you.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I'm sorry, this could have been much better prepared than what it is at the moment. But yeah, it was just really rushed, and we just have to live with it. So yeah, it might go over an hour, it might end in half an hour. We don't know. Let's see how it goes. Okay, can everyone see the screen? It's white.
White. Yeah.
Yep. Not anymore, I guess, right? Good. Okay, so hello again, and I want this to be more of a casual talk rather than a lecture, and try to kind of deliver like a partial experience of being at the AA. So I prepared this talk to explain the backbone of the visiting school brief. And it will include 3 years of research that I've taken with the students at the AA, with my teaching partner, Brendan Carlin, and also the most recent work that got branched out from the theme of counter typology research. And I also would like to share my appreciation to also the education that I've received from the AA, from SA8.0, and also who are both Cha Kyung and my tutors at the AA, and also Pier Vittorio Orelli and Maria Giudici, who are teaching in Diploma 14, who are also the tutors of NA, who's teaching together with us as Unit 1. So actually, the brief of the AA's unit and everything that I do had quite a big influence with figures like these people. And if you are already quite familiar with the work of Dogma, Black Square, Amit09, you might notice that the approaches kind of share with like a slight different angles. But anyway, in experimental program, there are currently 18 units. In diploma, there are 21 units. It's very intense environment where many different ideologies clash in one building. But also, it's quite beautiful to see there are so many different ways of practicing architecture. And I mean, through this talk, I hope you get to understand a light version of what the AA life could be. And I would like to share as much as possible of some of the student work that got produced over the past 3 years. So the first year was about proposing unfamiliar space that encourages the architecture of openness. And the second year was more focused on the typology and extracting the techniques that could be subverted. And last year was the intensification of typo production and the power of misusage. And the most recent work for this year's Seoul Biennale focuses on the close observation and tracking of Korean typology mutations, which is quite heavily related to the visiting school brief. But all these briefs share one simple agenda, which is investigating architecture for everyday life, live work that tend towards rejecting typological thinking or the institutionalized imposition of values, domestication, and forms of life, even utopian or idealistic ones. On one hand, we reject because it no longer makes sense, and on other, perhaps because ethically it was never okay. First thing we reject is category housing itself, because it already assumes too many things. So instead, we want to depart from research into real examples of emerging subjects and groups now are not getting what they need or want from mainstream society and are instead already forming alternatives. We want to help give these kind of individuals and collectives architecture. So this kind of approach means that we have to fundamentally rethink and perhaps reinvent architecture as profession, rethink our role as architects. To do that, sometimes we have to look back in human history. On Australian continent, millennia before Europeans or Asians had any knowledge of it, a nomadic tribe called the Achilpa roamed its vast landscapes. In a space without roads, borders, fences, or infrastructures, the Achilpa were not sedentary or contained, but were more inclined to identify with centers or points of reference like well, and use the landscapes as guide rather a rule. Their free movement was guided by a larger sacred pole called Kawa'awa, which they always carried with them. At each new campsite, the first thing they would do is dig a hole and plant a pole which established both physical and cosmic access around, which for them, the earth became inhabitable. While constantly being on the move and without the security and familiarity of a fixed place, the pole allowed them to carry their world everywhere to set order from chaos. Presently, we continue to witness accelerating technology and life experience change, and a dissolution and destruction of historical forms of place, evolve community, cultural, spiritual practices, and architecture and ways of life. A dissolution that increasingly wipes away any fixed configurations at all. We see an expanding blurring of disciplinary boundaries and of spheres of life which were separated. Work, house, shopping, production, reproduction, and consumptions blur. These kinds of divisions originated during industrialization and modernization, a period when corporations and the state became concerned with the organization of everyday life and types of family and housing. But state housing as a project concerned with the productivity of workers began in centers of mass accumulation of labor much earlier than industrialization. In this case, 4,000 years ago in Egypt, where we also know many of these workers were artisans and craftspeople directly involved in legitimizing and maintaining the rule of pharaohs. But it wasn't until in England between the 16th to 18th century, after a period of forced removal of people from their direct means of sustenance, in farming communal lands, which were then privatized, that people were forced to buy food on the market and sell their labor. Cities like London grew rapidly, and that state and corporate sponsors of housing became concerned with the habits and behaviors of the inhabitants. This is an early nuclear family housing project in London, where renters were required to go to church, be married, have references, and to follow strict protocols, time schedules, and discourse and on. Social housing projects were sponsored by figures like the founder of JP Morgan Bank, who are interested in increasing harmony and property values with the least investment. This is also when architecture became a university-trained profession. In earlier periods, architects were few and far between and only designed institutional buildings and housing for the wealthiest classes. Typology emerged as an important site of architectural theory. The first university-trained professional architects obsess over typology and daily life, values, morality. However, after a long neoliberal project, we continue to witness a dissolution of previous forms of life, community, family, and of typology, a rise of single-person household and now unusual family forms towards a condition that we might characterize as non-typological. The acceleration of innovation, change continues to produce ever more vividly one of the most common and pervasive features of contemporary or metropolitan life, a metaphysical and existential alienation and homelessness. In a sense, we have all become nomads, whether considering how increasingly often we shift jobs, cities, continents, or even if we stay in one place just like we are now, we are forced to constantly adapt to innovation, fashion, cycles of crisis, which leave us struggling in an openness with unforeseen dangers. In many ways, this is actually a promising and liberating development because it sets us free from historical forms of discipline, hierarchy, and constraints over who we can become. We see the emergence now of many of the physical features envisioned by early 20th centuries avant-garde architects, artists, authors, and critiques who envision transparency, openness, possessionlessness, and sharing where trust and security meant we no longer needed to seclude ourselves from neighbors. We see a rise of co-live spaces. Openness of physical spaces and sharing economy have paradoxically been perpetuated by the movement and the consequences of capitalist innovation and technology itself. We witness the emergence of new forms of global knowledge and resource sharing and the rise of the open source. But on the other hand, we can also see a telescoping of dependency and narrowing determination of over who we are. From a very young age, visible and invisible separations and disciplinaries operate in an increasingly small scales and undetectable ways, metaphorically placing us into a series of immaterial enclosures that produce who we are, our bodies, our mentality, habits, consciousness in their own image. Softness, lightness, blurriness in architecture, and the dissolution of legible typology, considered next to the fact that we work more and more and increasingly everywhere all the time. We could argue that this indicates that we have internalized the command of economy. This could indicate the disappearance of legible disciplinaries. And this internalization of discipline can be recognized in the traits we now value: adaptation, flexibility, innovativeness, competitiveness, and self-management. But these traits were historically constructed in the world of production to couple a new sense of meaning and purpose with behaviors that would also increase economic productivity and therefore impose rationalities onto life. Disciplinaries now reveal themselves in the form of their opposites. What appears liberating and familiar, shades of homeliness everywhere, become traps that use desiring features. We continue to witness capital and the state's abandonment of previous patriarchal form of welfare, protections, and services, a spiraling of cost, competition, and isolation, leaving us in a void of companionship and a void of care. When repeatedly threatened with a void, a loss of identity or stability, And so we reach for retrograde and destructive forms of refuge and home that never really existed. Faced with these voids, we reach for retrograde and destructive forms of refuge and home. The rise of the right with this distraction from the real causes, propose boundaries like big walls, and it appeals to take back control, which become quite dangerous illusions of security and identity. Retrograde family values, forms of life, and typological thinking are constantly idealized and reanimated from the dead. And deeply rooted values and ideologies like privacy, which is also invention of industrial era, become violently defended ideologies. The four walls, the door, and the lock does not give a form of autonomy, but instead it disposes us of the ability to negotiate, share, and reason with others. We become dependent on walls. And how could we expect more? The word privacy comes the Latin privare, which comes from the root deprive or rob. Architectures continue to manufacturing spectacles and masks that became machines that proliferate hierarchies and distraction and maintain the downward spiral of commodification. We again become agents of domestication. And we lock ourselves into a bad infinity of stasis and away from pursuing the radical possibilities for actual change opened by the void that we face. Instead, we might we might conceive of void in different positive sense and embrace it as opportunity. If we embrace the destruction of old hierarchies and paternalism, embrace our homelessness, and essentially realize that realities are ours to invent more than at any other time in human history. We should claim this new open, but for many of us, letting go of our old pathologies and dependencies can be quite scary. The open can be a terrifying and dangerous place. Perhaps we can learn something valuable from Achilpa. How can we have orientation and security, but not be dominated and contained with boundaries? Rejecting typological thinking means we have to challenge and undo fundamental forms of division and separation. We are seeking out emerging subjects and collectives now who, faced with the void of needs and wants, are already reinventing daily life on the ground and help to give them form. We are focused on the social and spatial dimensions of collectivizing or commoning reproduction, forms of labor concerned with the maintenance of the body, physical and emotional care, and therefore with social and political relationship. So one key reference for us is groups of women in the 19th century. Instead of protest to force the state and capital to make superficial concessions, instead took matters into their own hands, hired architects, and set about their own emancipation through reinventing forms of reproductive labor, notions of family and everyday life and architecture. Through commoning reproduction, we might denaturalize forms of life that dominate us, that we accept as natural, but are artificial and will change. We democratize the invention of alternatives and can free up space and time for us to pursue more individualized creative interests. We believe in the agency of architecture form. We want to use architecture to create space, to bound and demarcate, distinguish, so that something new has space to emerge. We want to use architecture to set up reference points that, like in the case of Achilpa, do not contain or bound, do not prescribe, and do not fix ways of life, but they will always change and evolve. The void is an opening to space in which we can begin to invent new realities. So to briefly explain, oh God, this image is not showing up, of how the unit approaches the research and design, I wanted to go through some key elements of the unit's brief. So beginning of the year, we start with juxtaposing 3 different formal languages, free, rational, and axial. So it's up to students' interpretations of what these words really mean to them and spatially describable. So, for example, rational space is a space for hyper-rational organization. Free space is a soft abstraction, and continuous space. Axial space is archetypal, hard and legible form of voids. And we also formulate our research topics that set the brief for individual design projects. And we often, actually, we always research and draw subjectivities, rituals, and forms of commoning, capturing everyday life and spaces that surrounds the rituals. So we operate as a group of forensic investigators. So I will go through some work from the first 2 years at the AA for this part, just to let you know that at the AA, students spend about a year on the research and the design project. So this is going to be a very reduced interpretation of the project. And also the outcome is an architectural proposal, which departs from the propositional argument and the thesis formulation. So it will be quite different from the visiting school brief, where we focus more on the observation. So starting from some anti-typological researches in Korea, Korean society forms intensive expectations such as social conformity, competition, forms of collectivity and obligation, and mass identity. These omnipresent contemporary K typologies manifest in desires that are mutating the city and way we live. However, we also witness the contrasting phenomena which are formed in various archetypes, such as bridges, parks. So Sangvin's study is based on the extreme pressure of Korean society, which has given rise to a strategies of withdrawal. Goshiwon, a single living compartment, carries a lot of problematic social and economic crises in Korea. However, Goshiwons can be also seen as an evident index of how contemporary subjectivity demands new architectural alternatives for work or live. We can also witness the possibility in constructing one's own temporal domestic space in an open hardscape under one same roof, which also happens in a collective way, away from typologies. The Megagoshiwon, or a giant house, is sitting on top of a gently sloped hill using the bridges as an archetype to create an open domestic landscape that allows collective or individual working, cooking, and bathing. Shana's K-pop incubator house is based on the research of both government-backed culture industry K-pop incubators and the dormitories of K-pop idol. Contrasting to the manufactured idol production system, Random Play, the K-pop dancers who self-organize multi-day events where everyone dances, become both audiences and performers. And they set up large camps together and share cooking, cleaning, living, life centered around dance. Here, the park is being misused as space, not only for staging the K-pop dance, but it's also being used for activities in everyday life. The project learns from the Random Play to propose a house for 50, in which the main living space is an enclosed spot, open park. Bounded by small but functionally undefined private rooms for everyday living. And semi-outdoor open space with collective cooking and dining spaces for everyone. The Sangha is a massive building type with the opaque facade, where Koreans increasingly flee the highly disciplinary society into matrices of endless banks or rooms, whose themes and contents are always rapidly mutating with the market's desire. Whatever bang proposes a mega Sangha as a house for 3,000, catering individuals' desires, commodified in various forms, as it doesn't really make sense to directly reject them. Instead, the project blurs any idea of normality and accommodates hundreds of different types of banks, proposing different versions of openness by level, such as level constantly reinvent life forms through creating banks, and an archive level of the objects of past banks being shared and reused in common. So outside of these Korean researches, the unit is open to students to explore their field of research based on individual fascination. But we usually encourage them to start from the context that they are more familiar with. So this project, for example, starts from Basque, then travels to Miami as a counterexample to contemporary food production and consumption. Georgia found on emerging forms of food commoning, Earth Table in Istanbul set up a humble sharing of home-cooked food with strangers, laying tablecloths and newspapers on the street, forming a half-a-mile table. In this non-typological space for collective dining, there is no authority limitations as to whom can participate or where it should end. For this, she designed a floating weekend house for 500 strangers to prepare food and feast together on the edge of Miami, which allows a new ritual of weekend cooking and dining in collective way. Matthew's project is based on the umbrella movement in Hong Kong. The project does not focus on the political demands made to the government and China. It learns from the way that people organize a way of living and working together on distinct form, not designed for people, the motorway. For 90 days, a highway turned into a giant house where people collectively organize and distribute domestic appliances, work and study, and negotiate their life form, eat, sleep together, and organize basic necessity of everyday life, like this shower booth. The project proposes, develops a collective house that departs from the universality, genericness, and yet a clear delineation of the motorway form. To create a platform for an unforeseeable life, city, and politics to emerge in negotiation. Lastly, UNIA researched how precarious workers were turning a Williamsburg, New York city gym into a place for ayahuasca ceremonies and sleeping and eating. The project questions whether architecture can support the unique qualities of remote natural environments. And replicate its exceptional qualities whilst allowing the emergence of new ways of inhabitation. So there are various mappings like the light condition, humidity, temperature, scent, formed by plants, jungle. So this jungle houses for 30 precarious New York workers. Sorry, there's something wrong with this slide. In which the core architecture and living space is a dense artificial jungle. The jungle house living space has no walls, ceiling, or even floor per se, and there are no signs of domestic familiarity. Selected plants are the architecture in the space, which forms various spatial qualities. So you don't see much of a common, architectural element. It's the plants that replaces all that. And this strips off a habitualized way of living, nor prescribed an idealized way of living. Okay, so moving on to the most recent brief from the AA, which was about the intensification of typal production and the power of misusage. Last summer, during quarantine, we were fully confronted with the coming to the fore of a phenomenon that predates even the rise of the internet, the dissolving and blurring of work, home, space, time, inside, and what was once outside, and even our typical identities and clarity of profession. In a seeming paradox, this blur has only been accelerated by its apparent opposite, the fixity and containment of quarantine and social distancing. We could say that inside became outside, the house or flat became undeniably and irreversibly the city. At once full-time office, studio, classroom, gym, cinema, and place for sleeping in any room. For example, my neighborhood London Victorian flats, which melted in any defined uses of functions during quarantine, was originally designed as a service Victorian to accommodate the rapidly increasing density of farmers and craftspeople from rural areas. Workers who were forced off land which was privatized, as I explained earlier in the presentation, and they were obliged to migrate to the cities, compete for waged industrial work. So London grew rapidly and got really polluted and diseased. So this led to a severe outbreak of cholera in 1848, which killed 52,000, mostly poor workers. Because of this, a series of public health acts were implemented and resulted in form of our Victorian that we see now. Its corridors, wall, windows, and divisions, and their dimensions. The epidemic costs the government and companies huge sums of money in lost productivity, social unrest, legal disputes, and compensation paid to families. So while the regulations were progressive and enacted for the protection of human life, Parliament admitted that they were purely economic. This is obviously very relatable to our situation. So while quarantine has caused so many of the intended and planned programs and functions of the city to blur and melt, we can see from the calls to return to work of political and business leaders that they are desperate to reestablish controlled forms of life and proper ordained planned uses that are instrumental to the status quo and life as endless production and routine. It is no surprise then that a sense of meaninglessness and hopelessness sets in, when it seems that we are merely obliged to adapt, prioritize the economy and struggle to maintain the old status quo. But the limbo we find ourselves in, our uncertainty, anxiety, and boredom with normalized society can be positive states or moods in which the familiar world is rendered uncanny or strange, and therefore opened up to other radically different possibilities. So more work of experimental 6 this year, which is actually quite relevant to the visiting school, will be presented on Monday, the 19th, 6:30 p.m. If you want to have a sneak peek of what they've produced already, then go on the Instagram, AA Experimental 6, and have a look at it. But I've invited 3 students who I think will be very helpful for the visiting school. So Cheryl critiqued on the perpetuating image of family and housing typologies in Tokyo. And also Yanling focused on researching contemporary tech workers in California and bringing these tech campuses soft typology to contain creative workers into their form, but actually, making it accessible for the city rather than the private entity. And Jun-sung, who researched Korean cafe, will take us from the history of the first cafe and how it landed to Korea and how we can understand cafe as a space of revolution throughout history. So yeah, everyone's welcome to join the session in 2 days. So last chapter of today's talk the most recent work for this year's Seoul Biennale focuses on the close observation and tracking of Korean typology mutations. So this is actually more relevant to what we are about to do for the visiting school. So first, I mean, it's the selected work in progress work. And it this unfaithful home overlaps with the part that I presented for the intro, so I'm not going to go over much. But this is the critical observation of mutation that negates the previous fate that was imposed as a nuclear family apartment. Just like the intro presentation, we currently witness various mutations that rejects the previous forms, but many are still subsumed by the existing institution and continue to reproduce the similar values that limits our behavior. So we really have to pay close attention as if we examine the X-ray of our bodies, because these mutations are often too dissolved and not easy to be noticed, but they are always with us and ready to be revealed to bring us somewhere new. And profaning infrastructure, architecture as infrastructure, infrastructure as architecture. So if we take Pojangmacha, the food stall and dining space situated in urban exterior as an example to understand how it gets recognized as a typology over time and as an archive of mutation. Pojangmacha became a distinctive Korean typology, not only through its distinct functionality, but also through various material culture and aesthetics. Through its social role as a relief space against the hyperproductive, especially in the 60s and 70s. And its political nature, it can only exist as an infrastructure serving the productive structure. And it always confronts and negates the planned vision of the city as it is not supposed to be there in the first place. So after numerous attempts to regulate and exterminate its form since the 1988 Seoul Olympic and the government's beautification project, aka New Order or New Behavior movement, Pojangmacha has finally given a death sentence in 2012. The form of Pojangmacha that we currently remember will soon disappear from the street. However, Pojangmacha has lost its relevance to its archetypal form and moved on much further with every step it has taken with mutation. We can capture three different paradigms. Paradoxically, due to the aligned vision of the city and the market's desire, we see Pojangmacha coming into the regulated indoor space, simulating and romanticizing the outdoor environments and the symbolic image of informality. So we see the increasing usage of Pojangmacha intervention as a fit-out tool, being imported to negate the containment during the quarantine state with the offices and our house. Another paradigm is the intensification of formality of temporal elements. We see the street with new usage with techniques and protocols, appropriation, collective management, and activations of utilities to sustain the survival of the death sentence form, which are a series of architectural operations, from extending the street plane to creating various conditions of interiorizing exterior without conventional elements to form separations. All elements combined, it legitimizes and allows the new usage of a seemingly unimaginable context in much larger scales that cannot be typically accommodated inside. So the last paradigm and arguably the latest mutation of Pojangmacha is the government-controlled model to organize the informality into a permanent form. So despite the fact that a form and the elements are predefined and limited to serving food and dining, the past mutation allowed various scales of dining forms to be activated on the street. And more importantly, Seoul Street to embed electrical, gas, and water to be accessed for a new usage of the street. So this already leads us to imagine using city's exterior as an interior and inhabiting the city as an exploded house. And the last part of the presentation, I would like to end it with architecture as nature. nature as infrastructure, infrastructure as architecture. Can we sleep outside in nature? So this question is not so easy to answer, and this is a seemingly very simple question, but in the context of Seoul, the answer is very complicated. So typically, Seoul lights would often narrow the possibility of doing this at the available camping site within the periphery of the city. How do we arrive in this condition is what I wanted to ask. And the Latin etymology of camping, campus, means level ground, which is open to the possibility of any form of inhabitation. However, this vulnerable open form and the dwellers were constantly shaped and delimited by multiple institutions. Korean camping sites have taken a series of transformation along with an intense process of modernization. So from its first exposure to media in 1927 to the current state, the physical form and the social conception of camping mutated through elite leisure for missionary, a form of education under colonial rule, military encampment at wartime, a post-war poverty shelter, regulated and designated form under military dictatorships, accessible leisure infrastructure for refreshing hyper-competitive society. So the current familiar forms that we recognize as Korean camping site have strong ties to the strict regulatory framework in 1980s to prevent campers from cooking, washing, or sleeping outside of designated area, i.e., the camping sites now. So this period also coincides with when middle-class nuclear family ideals started flaring out, along with camping as a lifestyle and individual car ownership, the My Car boom, which were heavily promoted by the major car manufacturing companies such as Kia Motors. So K camping sites were only destined to be hybridized by the road network, orderly compartments of eating, washing, sleeping, and desires of conflicting ideals of individuality, alternativity, and conformity. As the name indicates, auto campingjang, the camping sites for automobile tourists, is a hybrid of the privatized camping site and the car park. Auto campingjangs are often camouflaged in Seoul as the remoteness from the city is the main appeal to the part-time suburban inhabitants. Therefore, the campsites are inevitably subordinate to the urban condition. It ensures the return of contemporary workers back to the city in the most efficient way. But the typology also unlocks unfamiliar scales of domestic chores, such as cooking, washing, which are already quite different from the typical dwelling enclosures of Seoul. We also see more and more people choose this as a new form of lifestyle that is either frequently repeated or constructed as an alternative form of enclosures for more than several months, even years. We need to pay close attention to what the infrastructure is made of to reveal the techniques. The flexible level ground that distributes grid, modifying natural landscape, or adapting natural features into a artificial car park. Various techniques to construct the human man-made grid can be captured, and flexible or unusual life forms starts to emerge on top of this grid, the new ground form. So this is the last slide. And so the important question we may need to ask as an architect is, have we ever had the ownership of the grid and the infrastructure to construct our life forms? Now is the time to ask how a new conception of architecture, nature, infrastructure might become a means to open up the city to common use by its inhabitants, to experiment with forms of architecture, social relationship, and life at least as multiplicitous as the number of inhabitants, 9,960,212 people in Seoul. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you, James. Right, thank you for your presentation. Well, you were worrying at the beginning of the presentation, but it was great, actually. Yeah.
Oh, really? Thank you
Yeah.
very much. I
It's
really
all very clear
appreciate
and good. Yeah.
it. Thank you. Thank you. I hope you
Right.
guys enjoyed.
We did. I'm sure people did. I don't know. I can't see their faces, but do we have any questions or comments from the audience? Maybe Jay can start.
Yes. Thank you very much for the great lectures, and really nice to see the AA experimenters unit here. And I have a very short and very little questions. And as far as I know, the typology defined actually gradually historically based on the memory and living conditions, etc., through the whole years. But I think anti-type form you guys trying to achieve are required design by the new life of metropolitan, I think. So you trying to reach anti-typology or anti-type is reached by looking at the social change and new life. But I would like to know a little bit more about what aspect could you bring the new form of type in 2021 through the unit. So actually the social agenda was some specific idea, what kind of aspects are really important to define anti-typological studies or form through the unit. Yes.
Wow, I think that's going to be almost impossible to answer in short amounts of time, but I'll try my best.
I know. Yes, I know.
I think actually it's really great that you recognize that we mostly follow these new tendencies and the new emerging subjects who are already creating the alternatives to the for their realities construction. And these happens mostly because of the unmet needs they encounter in the current form of life, and the capitalistic regimes and all the difficulties that they just confront, and they are active enough to just confront it and construct away from the typal thinking. So when I say typology, it's discussions on the production of types and typal productions of like similar values and subjectivities and etc. And it was actually really fascinating to see examples from the work of actually another AA graduate as an architect, but they are not the main agency of this this new housing association. So the students from the AA visited Seoul 2 years ago, and we went to Eunhae 공동체, Eunhae community, which was designed by Urban Topology, I think. They are also AA graduates. And it was just like a totally different experience. Like it's very surreal, the way they organize their domestic chores and the childcare policies that they just constructed almost like an off-grid condition within the city of Seoul. And that's a moment of like finding the anti-typological movement itself. And I think as an architect, what we can do is we can capture these kind of really small movements, although that Eunhae 공동체 is relatively a big movement, I would say, socially. But we witness very small ones, even from the most commercial activities. But if we can get inspired and capture the opportunities and amplify the condition and make it really accessible for a lot of people, so that they can acknowledge that actually different realities are available. Different forms are not so strange. Therefore, the typal way of living is not the only way of living, is essentially what we are trying to pursue and deliver for the contemporary condition. And basically, again, I think the question of the multiplicity is the main issue here. Like, how can we design ambiguity in a really precise way that can allow a lot of different possibilities, is what we're trying to propose. And that's, in a way, a version of anti-typology for me. Thank you.
Yes, yes. I think the ambiguity is very important terms actually for those studies. Actually, what we've done last two days, and we trying to find what kind of ambiguity we can develop, can discover from the city between physicality and sociality. So I think this year I hope to see more about the ambiguity from the Unit 1. Thank you.
Thank you. Ko?
Yeah, it will be really related question. And what I thought is like the non-typological architecture you like showed before, not yours, is like more open to like open use or open function. It's more like free space with like universal architecture, something like. But what I felt from like the one AA student produced or something from your research is like kind of anti-typology architecture. It seems like focusing on like specific one events. So the results look similar, but it felt for me, it's like it looks really different gesture. So it's some parties feel like really limited to use or limited to like kind of some events. So that was like kind of my question, like how you would deal and what's the difference thing.
I think actually what's funny was we actually departed from quite similar to your current brief in our first year at the RCA and the AA, the non-referential space that we cannot really recognize as any kind of typology. And then there was this critical moment that, oh God, like this is turning into Rolex Center for every project, like, and Ishigami for every project. So it's just like like the soft typology that Pier Vittorio Aureli dogma criticizes a lot. That the typologists that our contemporary typologists are already quite fragmented and quite invisible, without creating this new effort of making it even softer, right? But architects are just obsessed with creating the latest iterations of this like unrecognizable soft typologies that you enter into the space and you don't even know what you're submitting yourself into, that you don't realize that you are competing while you are enjoying, and being totally exploited within the space. And like every communication that you have within this like conversational space, like the Rolex Center, like the library, but cafe, but sleeping pods, but like everything melted at the same time into one space. It's just enhancing this, like, the contemporary conditions and just more uncertainties and precarity to a degree, I think. Although it proposes like a lot of new great opportunities that's spatially never executed before. So it's a totally you know, like like it's a great project, of course. Well, I'm not only criticizing. But so that's the moment that we departed from, okay, soft typology maybe is not really telling, or maybe it's not encountering the issues that we want to tackle. It's probably enhancing the precarity. So what are the different approaches? It was actually adapting the very distinctive typology that's archaic or noticeable, but making a profanation of it, and like potential subversion that comes out from it, because the history tells us that these typologies constantly gets profaned, and you know, it's given its new usage over time, over and over again. So, but what are the spatial features that we can you know, extract and again, like reimagine from the formal usage to the new usage? Is it's kind of the new struggle that we are facing within the unit's latest development. So that's why, you know, sometimes it looks non-typological, sometimes it looks anti-typological in very purposeful way. So yeah, I mean, thank you so much for, again, like capturing these really subtle struggles that I'm internally having. So yeah, I really appreciate this.
Thank you. Can we hear anybody from the students, maybe? No, it's the first day, so students are very quiet, but 한국말로 해주셔도 돼요. No?
I mean, I totally understand. Like you know, if I'm a normal, like an audience, I never ask questions in public, even at the AA. I'm like, I'm a bloody tutor at the AA. I'm scared to do that.
Yeah.
They can ask maybe later on, I think.
Yeah. I mean,
Yeah.
just, you know, contact us like separately if you
Yes.
want to know more, anything,
Yeah,
just, you know, do whatever you feel comfortable of doing.
Or email him, right? He's gonna reply.
Yeah, you can email directly to James, or you can always leave a note to this chat room so that we can keep learning about it. I think you guys can learn more by asking, because just listening the lecture is just not enough. I know it's only the first day, and then having like an hour lecture is never enough to understand somebody's agenda, but I think you have to keep questioning. All right. If you don't have any more questions, maybe. Oh.
Yeah, I saw one hand up.
Or maybe not. Maybe not. Maybe he was just done.
Oh, okay.
Okay. Yeah. Maybe we can move on to J-Hub's presentation then. Is that all right?
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah, unfortunately, Unit 1, we have to gather now and listen to the recordings of